I never thought I would find myself in a situation like this. It started out as a harmless curiosity, the kind that comes from being around someone for a long time, a familiarity that grows into something stronger when you're not observing. And perhaps it's my fault for allowing myself to get caught in the web of fascination that surrounded my mother-in-law, Isabella. I stayed with my mother-in-law for a few weeks while my wife was away on a business trip. Isabella was kind and generous, always cooking my favorite meals and doing her best to make me feel at home. She was lively, sometimes even flirtatious, though I told myself that was just her charming nature. She teased me often, touching me when it wasn't necessary and giving me playful smiles that made my heart race. It was wrong. I knew that, but I couldn't deny that it excited me. One night I found myself alone in the house. My father-in-law was working late and Isabella was upstairs. I heard music in the hallway, soft, slow jazz, and couldn't help but follow it. The door to Isabella's room was slightly ajar, and before I knew it, I was standing there, peering through the crack. My heart raced as I watched her. She was standing in front of the mirror, her body swaying to the music, a glass of wine in her hand. She was wearing a satin slip that skimmed her figure, her hair cascading down her shoulders. I should have turned away, should have walked away, but I couldn't. She looked so different in that moment, so carefree, so sensual, so different from the motherly figure I was used to. She walked over to the bed and set the wine on the nightstand. She sat on the edge, closed her eyes, and ran her fingers over her naked shoulders, as if lost in a world of her own making. I knew I was crossing a dangerous line, but something in me wanted to see more, to understand this other side of her. Suddenly she lifted her head and looked at me through the crack in the door. My heart stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was silence for a moment, only the music playing softly in the background. Her lips curved into a smile, a knowing smile that sent shivers down my spine. She didn't look shocked or angry. Instead, she raised an eyebrow, as if daring me to stay, to keep watching. I stepped back in panic, my heart racing as I backed away from the door. I walked back to my room, my mind reeling from what had just happened. Had she really seen me? And that smile, was she inviting me in or was she just toying with me? I didn't know what to think, but I couldn't get her image out of my head. The way she looked at me, the way she moved, it was all imprinted in my memory. I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, wondering what it meant for us. I couldn't deny it anymore. I was drawn to her. She captivated me in a dangerous and intoxicating way. And from the way she looked at me, I knew she realized it too. The next morning, Isabella acted as if nothing had happened. She was her usual self, smiling, teasing, making breakfast. But when her hand touched mine as she handed me a cup of coffee, I saw that same gleam in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of what had happened, and perhaps an unspoken promise that there was more to come. As the days passed, the tension between us only grew. It showed in the little things, the way she caught my gaze across the room, the way her laughter seemed to linger a little longer when I was near, the way her touch seemed more deliberate, more meaningful. A new dynamic emerged between us that neither of us talked about, but both of us deeply experienced. One afternoon, when my wife was not yet home and my father-in-law was at work, Isabella asked me to help her with something in the garden. The day was warm and she was wearing a sundress that fit her curves. We worked side by side, and her laughter filled the air as she joked and teased me about my lack of gardening skills. I couldn't help but smile, feeling the attraction between us grow stronger with each passing moment. At one point she leaned in close to me, her breath warming my ear, as she whispered something about the flowers we were planting. Her hand rested on my arm and her fingers lightly touched my skin. The touch sent shivers running down my spine. I turned to look at her, and for a moment our faces were a few centimeters apart. I could see the desire in her eyes, the unspoken words that hovered in the air between us. I wanted to kiss her. The thought struck me like lightning, and I knew she could see it in my eyes. But before I could do anything, she pulled away, a mischievous smile playing on her lips. She went back to the flowers, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding and my mind spinning with thoughts of what could have happened and what else could happen. That evening, we found ourselves alone in the living room. The soft light of the lamps cast a warm glow over the room, and Isabella poured us each a glass of wine. We sat down on the couch, and there was a tense silence between us. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine as if trying to catch my thoughts. I felt my pulse quicken, and the room seemed to shrink around us. She leaned back, keeping her gaze on me, and took a slow sip of wine. "You know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "sometimes I think there's something unspoken between us." Her eyes sank into mine, and I realized that the moment of truth had arrived. I could either deny it, pretend everything was normal, or admit what we both knew. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe, I replied, my voice shaking slightly. Maybe some things don't need to be said. There was silence for a moment, only the sound of our breathing and the ticking of the clock on the wall. And then she smiled a slow, knowing smile that made my heart race. She set down her glass and moved closer, resting her hand on my knee. Or maybe, she whispered, her voice like silk, it is. My breath caught as she leaned over and brushed her lips against my ear. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of the moment, the anticipation and the danger. Everything in me wanted to give in, to cross that line. But I hesitated, knowing the consequences, knowing how wrong it was. But Isabella didn't pull away. She stayed where she was, her lips barely touching my skin and her hand moving slowly up my leg. It was a game. A dangerous game we were both willing to play. And I knew that no matter what happened next, there would be no turning back. The line had been crossed, and now all that was left was to see how far we were willing to go.